The scorching summer sun beat down on the small town of Willow Creek, Texas, as Adelaide Grant clutched her sleeping 6-month-old daughter to her chest and stepped off the dusty stagecoach. The year was 1876, and the whispers followed her like shadows as she made her way down the main street, her chin held high despite the shame that clung to her like a second skin. Adelaide had come to this frontier town with nothing but a small carpetbag, a baby, and desperate hope. At 22, she was already labeled a fallen woman, shunned by her own family back east after the father of her child had abandoned them both upon learning of her condition. Now, with nowhere else to turn, she had come to Willow Creek where her late aunt had once lived, praying for work and a fresh start where the weight of judgment might be lighter. "Madam, you need some help with your bags." The stagecoach driver's voice was polite, but his eyes held the familiar flicker of judgment as they moved from her face to the infant in her arms. "Thank you, but I can manage," Adelaide replied, adjusting her threadbare shawl around her shoulders with her free hand while trying to maintain her grip on the carpetbag. As she turned toward the town's only hotel, the baby stirred and began to fuss. Adelaide bounced her gently, murmuring soft words of comfort while painfully aware of the disapproving glances from two women standing outside the general store. "Another one of those women," one whispered to the other, not bothering to lower her voice. "No wedding ring and a baby. Disgraceful." Adelaide felt her cheeks burn but kept walking. She had endured worse in Philadelphia after James had left her pregnant and alone. At least here, no one knew her story. Not yet, anyway. The baby's cries grew louder, echoing through the dusty street. Adelaide paused, setting down her bag to better adjust her daughter when a shadow fell across them both. "Seems like you could use a hand after all." The deep voice belonged to a tall man in a worn Stetson, trail dust coating his clothes and boots. Unlike the others, his blue eyes held no judgment as they met hers, just a straightforward kind of assessment. He stood with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, one hand resting on his belt near a well-worn holster. "I'm fine, thank you," Adelaide said stiffly, not wanting to invite more gossip by accepting help from a strange man. "No offense intended, madam," he replied, tipping his hat. "Just offering assistance. That bag looks heavy, and you've got your hands full with the little one." Before she could protest further, he picked up her carpetbag. "Name's Knox Porter. I've got my wagon just down the street if you need a ride somewhere." Adelaide hesitated, bouncing her increasingly fussy daughter. "I'm Adelaide Grant, and this is Elizabeth." She paused. "I was heading to the hotel." Knox's expression shifted slightly. "Hotel's full up with the cattle buyers in town. Mrs. Wilkins might have a room to let above the cafe, though." He gestured down the street. "I can take you there if you'd like." Adelaide assessed him carefully. Though dusty and weather-beaten, there was something in his steady gaze that didn't set off alarms. Still, she had learned the hard way not to trust too easily. "That's very kind, Mr. Porter, but Knox, please, and it's no trouble. My ranch is just outside town." Was heading back that way anyhow. Adelaide's options were limited, and Elizabeth was getting hungrier by the minute. With reluctance born of necessity, she nodded. "Thank you. I would appreciate that." As they walked toward his wagon, Adelaide felt the stares of townspeople following them. Knox seemed oblivious, or perhaps just unconcerned with the gossip they were generating. His wagon was simple but sturdy, with a team of 2 chestnut horses waiting patiently in the late afternoon heat. Knox placed her bag in the back and then, with surprising gentleness for a man with such calloused hands, helped Adelaide and Elizabeth up onto the wooden seat. "You're new to Willow Creek," he said as he climbed up beside her. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my Aunt Martha lived here years ago." "I thought." She trailed off, unsure how much to reveal. Knox clicked his tongue at the horses, setting them in motion. "Martha Holloway lived in the yellow house near the creek." Adelaide turned to him in surprise. "Yes, did you know her?" Everyone knew Miss Martha, fine woman. "Sorry to hear she was your aunt. She passed about 3 years back." Adelaide's heart sank. She had suspected as much when her letters went unanswered, but hearing it confirmed eliminated her last hope of family assistance. "I know," she said quietly. "I had hoped to find someone who might have known her, perhaps help me find work." Knox guided the horses down the street, his profile strong against the setting sun. "What kind of work are you looking for? Anything respectable," Adelaide replied, adjusting Elizabeth, who had finally quieted. "I can sew, cook, clean. I was a teacher's assistant back in Philadelphia before." She stopped, not wanting to finish that sentence. Knox nodded, not pressing her to continue. "Town's growing. Might be opportunities. Mrs. Wilkins at the cafe is always complaining about needing help." They pulled up in front of a modest two-story building with Willow Creek Cafe painted on a wooden sign above the door. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the open windows. "Let me talk to her," Knox said, helping Adelaide down from the wagon. "She's ornery but fair." Adelaide stood nervously on the boardwalk, Elizabeth now awake and gazing around with curious eyes. The baby had James's dark hair, but Adelaide's green eyes a constant reminder of the man who had promised to marry her and then vanished when faced with responsibility. Knox returned a few minutes later with a stout woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, flour dusting her apron. "So you're Martha's niece," Mrs. Wilkins said, looking Adelaide up and down, her gaze lingering on Elizabeth. Her expression wasn't exactly friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. "Knox says you need work and a place to stay." "Yes, madam," Adelaide replied, standing straighter. "I'm a hard worker and quick to learn." Mrs. Wilkins's eyes narrowed. "And the child, who'll mind her while you work?" Adelaide's heart sank. This was always the sticking point. "I can work with her. She's a good baby, doesn't fuss much. Or I could pay someone from my wages." "HMPH," Mrs. Wilkins interrupted. "I need help in the mornings and evenings. Got a room upstairs that's not much, but it's clean. $5 a week including meals, taken from your wages. You can bring the child, but if she disrupts my customers, we'll have to make other arrangements." Relief flooded through Adelaide. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins, I accept." The older woman nodded curtly. "Start tomorrow, 5 o'clock sharp." "Knox, show her up to the room." With that, she turned and went back inside. Knox picked up Adelaide's bag again. "Don't mind her gruffness. She's bark with very little bite." Adelaide followed him through the cafe, acutely aware of the curious stares from the few late afternoon customers. The room upstairs was small but clean as promised, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small table, and a window overlooking the main street. "It's perfect," Adelaide said, meaning it. After months of uncertainty, even this sparse room felt like luxury. Knox set down her bag and lingered awkwardly by the door. Town can be a bit unwelcoming to newcomers, especially. He gestured vaguely toward Elizabeth. "Especially unmarried mothers," Adelaide finished for him, a hint of defiance in her voice. Knox had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Folks around here just need time to get to know you. Mrs. Wilkins giving you a chance is a good start." He paused. "If you need anything, my ranch is about 3 miles north. The Porter place. Anyone can point you in the right direction." Adelaide was touched by his kindness but wary of becoming the subject of more gossip. "Thank you, Mr. Porter Knox. You've been very kind." He tipped his hat again. "Just being neighborly, Miss Grant. Good luck to you and little Elizabeth." With that, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the wooden stairs. Alone at last, Adelaide sat on the edge of the bed, Elizabeth cradled in her arms. "Well, little one," she whispered, "it's just you and me now, but we have a roof over our heads and work to do. Things are looking up." She couldn't have known then how their lives would become entangled with the quiet cowboy who had shown them unexpected kindness on their first day in Willow Creek. The first week at Mrs. Wilkins's cafe tested Adelaide's endurance to its limits. Each morning, she rose before dawn to feed and change Elizabeth, before heading downstairs to help prepare for the breakfast rush. Mrs. Wilkins had grudgingly allowed her to keep a small basket beside the kitchen where Elizabeth could nap while Adelaide worked. When the baby was awake and fussy, Adelaide would strap her to her chest with a length of fabric, working one-handed when necessary. The cafe's regular customers quickly formed opinions about the new young mother. Some of the women sniffed disapprovingly when they saw her with the baby. Others, particularly the older ranch hands and miners who remembered their own hardships, left generous tips and occasionally made silly faces at Elizabeth when they thought no one was looking. By Friday, Adelaide's arms ached from carrying trays of food, and her back throbbed from bending over the washbasin cleaning dishes. But for the first time in months, she had earned her own money and provided for her daughter without relying on charity or pity. "You're doing well enough," Mrs. Wilkins commented gruffly as they closed up that evening. Coming from the stern woman, it was high praise indeed. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins," Adelaide replied, wiping down the last table. Elizabeth was finally sleeping in her basket after a fussy afternoon. "Sunday's your day off," Mrs. Wilkins said. "Most folks go to church. Reverend Parker preaches a good sermon." She paused, giving Adelaide a meaningful look. "Might help your standing in town." Adelaide understood the implication. Church attendance might help counter the assumptions people had made about her character. "I'll consider it," she said diplomatically, though the thought of facing the entire town's scrutiny at once was daunting. On Saturday morning, Adelaide was surprised to see Knox Porter enter the cafe shortly after opening. He looked fresher than when she'd first met him, his dark hair damp and combed, his blue shirt bringing out the color of his eyes. "Morning, Miss Grant," he said, removing his hat as he approached the counter where she was arranging pies. "How are you and little Elizabeth settling in?" "We're managing well, thank you," Adelaide replied, painfully aware of Mrs. Wilkins watching from the kitchen doorway with interest. "What can I get for you?" "Coffee and whatever Mrs. Wilkins recommends for breakfast," he said, sliding onto a stool at the counter rather than taking a table. "Been up since 4 moving cattle to the north pasture. Could use something substantial." As Adelaide turned to relay his order, Mrs. Wilkins appeared with a large plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Already got it ready, Knox. Saw you ride in." She set the plate down with more gentleness than Adelaide had seen her display all week. "Much obliged, Mrs. Wilkins." "Your cooking's worth the ride into town." He flashed a smile that transformed his usually serious face, revealing a small dimple in his right cheek. Mrs. Wilkins actually blushed. "Go on with you," she said, but looked pleased as she returned to the kitchen. Adelaide brought Knox his coffee, noticing the way his calloused fingers wrapped around the mug's strong, capable hands that looked like they'd done honest work all their lives. "How's the ranch?" she asked, making polite conversation as she wiped down the counter beside him. "Busy. Spring calving season means not much sleep." He took a sip of coffee. "But I'm not complaining. Good year so far." "Do you run it alone?" Adelaide asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal. Knox didn't seem to mind. "Got 3 hands who help Miguel, Silas, and old Pete. Good men, but it's my responsibility since Pa passed 2 years back." "I'm sorry to hear about your father," Adelaide said sincerely. Knox nodded his thanks and continued eating. Elizabeth chose that moment to wake up, her cries audible from the kitchen. "Excuse me," Adelaide said, hurrying to attend to her daughter. When she returned with Elizabeth snuggled against her shoulder, Knox had finished his meal and was paying Mrs. Wilkins. He turned as Adelaide approached. "She's growing," he commented, looking at the baby. "Like a weed," Adelaide agreed, bouncing Elizabeth gently. "Sometimes I swear she's bigger in the evening than she was in the morning." Knox smiled again, this time directing it at Elizabeth, who stared at him with wide eyes. "My mother used to say that about me. Said I'd eat her out of house and home before I was 10. There was something about the gentle way this rough-hewn cowboy looked at her daughter that touched Adelaide. Most men either ignored Elizabeth or regarded her as an unfortunate complication. "Will we see you at church tomorrow?" Knox asked, settling his hat back on his head. Adelaide hesitated. "I'm not sure. Elizabeth can be fussy in crowds." "Folks might talk more if you don't come," he said quietly so only she could hear. "First impressions stick in a small town." She knew he was right. "Then I suppose we'll be there." "Good, I'll save you a seat." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Adelaide wondering why this virtual stranger seemed so concerned with her welfare. Sunday morning dawned clear and hot. Adelaide dressed in her best dress, a modest blue cotton that had seen better days, but was still presentable. She put Elizabeth in the white christening gown that Adelaide's mother had sewn before disowning her daughter for her disgrace. As she walked toward the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street, Adelaide felt as though every eye in town was upon her. Ladies in their Sunday finery whispered behind gloved hands. Men nodded politely, but with reservation. Just as her courage began to falter, a familiar figure appeared beside her. "Morning, Miss Grant," Knox said, falling into step with her. He was dressed in clean black trousers, a white shirt, and a black vest, his dark hair slicked back. "And good morning to you too, Miss Elizabeth." The baby gurgled in response, reaching a chubby hand toward him. "She remembers you," Adelaide said with surprise. Knox's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Got away with the ladies, I reckon," he joked, then looked embarrassed at his own words. "That is, babies usually take to me. My sister has 4 little ones." They approached the church steps, where Reverend Parker greeted his congregation. He was a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and piercing eyes that assessed Adelaide thoroughly as Knox made the introductions. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Miss Grant," the Reverend said, his voice neither warm nor cold. "Any friend of Knox Porter is welcome in our church." Adelaide couldn't help but notice how the pastor's endorsement, coupled with Knox's escort, caused a subtle shift in the expressions around them. Being seen with one of the area's established ranchers gave her a legitimacy she hadn't possessed on her own. Inside, Knox led her to a pew about halfway down the aisle. The whispers continued, but now they were tinged with curiosity rather than outright condemnation. "Don't mind them," Knox murmured as they sat down. "News is a precious commodity out here. They'll find something else to talk about soon enough." The service was longer than Adelaide was accustomed to, and Elizabeth grew restless toward the end. Knox surprised her by wordlessly holding out his hands to take the baby. Even more surprising was how readily Elizabeth went to him, settling contentedly against his broad chest. "You're good with her," Adelaide whispered as the Reverend delivered his final remarks. Knox shrugged slightly. "Like I said, lots of practice with my sister's brood." He looked down at Elizabeth, who was now playing with his finger. "Besides, she's an easy one to like." Something warm unfurled in Adelaide's chest at his words, not just the compliment to her daughter, but the ease with which he had accepted them both, ignoring the social stigma that made others keep their distance. After the service, Knox introduced her to several townspeople, including his sister Margaret and her husband. The introductions didn't immediately dispel all the suspicious glances, but they opened doors that might otherwise have remained firmly closed. As they walked back toward the cafe, Elizabeth now sleeping soundly in Adelaide's arms, Knox seemed to be wrestling with something. "Miss Grant Adelaide, if I may," he finally said, "I have a proposition for you." Adelaide tensed. She had received propositions before after James abandoned her. None had been honorable. Noticing her reaction, Knox quickly added, "A business proposition. Nothing improper. Go on," she said cautiously. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Rivera, is returning to Mexico next month to care for her ailing mother. I need someone to cook and keep house at the ranch." He looked at her directly. "The pay would be better than what Mrs. Wilkins can offer, and you'd have your own cabin, small but private. Elizabeth would have fresh air and room to grow." Adelaide was stunned by the offer. "But the gossip, your reputation," Knox waved away her concern. "Mrs. Rivera will still be there for the next few weeks as you get settled. And after that, Miguel's wife Teresa lives on the property. There'd be no impropriety." He paused. "I'm offering because you need the work and I need the help. Simple as that." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Even with chaperones, a single woman living on a bachelor's ranch would raise eyebrows. "Why would you do this?" Adelaide asked. "You barely know me." Knox was quiet for a moment. "My mother raised me and my sister alone after my father went off to the war when I was 10. He came back, but he wasn't the same man. She worked herself to the bone to keep us fed and clothed. I reckon I have a soft spot for women doing the same." His honesty touched her. Still, she hesitated. "I should talk to Mrs. Wilkins first. She gave me a chance when no one else would." Knox nodded. "Of course, think on it. The offer stands whenever you're ready." They had reached the cafe. Knox tipped his hat in farewell, his eyes lingering on Elizabeth's sleeping face for a moment before he turned and walked away. Inside, Mrs. Wilkins was waiting, a knowing look in her eyes. "So Knox Porter's taken an interest in you and the little one," she said without preamble. Adelaide flushed. "It's not like that. He's just being kind." Mrs. Wilkins snorted. "Knox Porter doesn't just do anything. Man's as deliberate as they come." She studied Adelaide's face. He offer you a job at his place yet? Surprised, Adelaide nodded, thought as much, saw how he was looking at you both during service. Mrs. Wilkins sighed. You should take it. But I've only just started here. I wouldn't want to leave you short-handed. The older woman waved dismissively. Girl, I've run this cafe for 15 years. I'll manage. Pays better at the Porter Ranch, and that baby needs space to crawl around, not be cooped up in this little room. Adelaide was touched by the woman's gruff concern. You've been very good to us. Pshaw. Mrs. Wilkins busied herself with a pot on the stove. Just doing what Martha would have wanted. She always had a soft spot for strays. She turned back to Adelaide. Knox Porter is the most respected man in this county. His vouching for you means something. And he's not one to care about wagging tongues. Adelaide considered this. I'll think about it. But in truth, her mind was already made up. The prospect of better pay, a private cabin, and fresh country air for Elizabeth was too tempting to refuse. What she didn't quite admit to herself was how Knox's kind blue eyes and gentle hands with her daughter had factored into her decision. 2 days later, Adelaide found herself in Knox's wagon again, this time with all her meager possessions, and Elizabeth secured in a makeshift sling across her chest. The town of Willow Creek fell away behind them as they followed a well-worn trail north through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers. It's beautiful, Adelaide said, taking in the vast open space. Having spent her life in Philadelphia's crowded streets, the expanse of sky and land was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. Wait till you see it at sunset, Knox replied, a hint of pride in his voice. When the light hits those hills just right, there's not a prettier sight in all of Texas. As they crested a gentle rise, the Porter Ranch came into view. A substantial 2-story house of weathered wood stood in a small valley, flanked by a large barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. Cattle grazed in the distance, and horses moved about in a nearby paddock. Home, sweet home, Knox said, guiding the horses down the slope. Been in the family for 30 years. My pa built that house with his own hands after he brought my mother out from Kentucky as a bride. It's lovely, Adelaide said sincerely. After months of uncertainty, the solid permanence of the place was deeply appealing. As they approached, a middle-aged Mexican woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. 3 men, one older with a white beard, one young and broad-shouldered, and one Hispanic man about Knox's age paused in their work by the barn to watch their arrival. That's Mrs. Rivera, Knox explained, and over there are Pete Silas and Miguel, my ranch hands. Knox helped Adelaide down from the wagon, conscious of the baby between them. Mrs. Rivera approached, her dark eyes curious but kind as she took in Adelaide and Elizabeth. Mrs. Rivera, this is Miss Adelaide Grant and her daughter Elizabeth. They'll be taking over your duties when you leave, Knox said. The woman smiled warmly. Welcome, Miss Grant. I am very happy to meet you, and this beautiful Nina. She gently touched Elizabeth's cheek, earning a gummy smile from the baby. Thank you, Adelaide replied, relieved by the woman's friendly greeting. I show you the cabin now, then the house. Mrs. Rivera looked to Knox for confirmation. Good idea. I'll have Silas bring Miss Grant's things over. Knox turned to Adelaide. Get settled in, and we can talk more at supper. 6 o'clock in the main house. The cabin was a short walk from the main house, close enough to be convenient but far enough for privacy. It was small but sturdy, with a front porch facing the creek. Inside was a single room with a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the window, a dresser, and a bed with a colorful quilt. Mr. Porter fix it up for you, Mrs. Rivera explained as she showed Adelaide around. Last 3 days, he work after dark. New roof, new floor. She pointed to a wooden cradle in the corner. He make that for the bebe. Adelaide ran her hand over the cradle, touched by the unexpected thoughtfulness. It was beautifully crafted, sanded smooth with care, with rockers that curved gently at each end. He made this for Elizabeth. The idea of the taciturn rancher working by lamplight to craft a cradle for her daughter brought an unexpected lump to her throat. Mrs. Rivera nodded, a knowing gleam in her eye. Senor Knox, he good man. Work hard, say little. She smiled at Elizabeth. but I think he have soft heart for little ones. After Silas delivered her trunk and bags, Adelaide spent the afternoon settling in, amazed at how quickly the small cabin began to feel like home. Elizabeth seemed to sense the change as well, contentedly exploring the new space from the safety of a blanket on the floor. At 5:45, Adelaide changed into a fresh dress, arranged her hair, and made her way to the main house with Elizabeth. Mrs. Rivera welcomed them into a large, airy kitchen that smelled of beef and fresh bread. "The men wash up now," she explained, showing Adelaide where to set the table in the adjoining dining room. "Senor Knox say you eat with family, not in kitchen." Adelaide was surprised. She had expected to take her meals separately, as befitted her position as hired help. The ranch hands entered first, having cleaned up after their day's work. They nodded respectfully to Adelaide, each taking time to greet Elizabeth, who watched the strangers with wide eyes. "Miss Grant," said the older man, Pete, removing his hat. "Pleasure to have you and the little lady here." Knox was the last to arrive, his hair damp from washing, dressed in a clean shirt. "I see you've met everyone," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Please sit." He indicated the chair to his right. The meal was simple but delicious: pot roast with vegetables, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily among the men, mostly concerning ranch business, but they made efforts to include Adelaide explaining terms she didn't understand and sharing stories of life on the frontier. What struck her most was how they treated Elizabeth not as an embarrassment or burden, but as the newest and most treasured member of their small community. Miguel made silly faces that set the baby giggling. Silas fashioned a little horse out of a dinner roll for her to play with. Even old Pete softened when Elizabeth grabbed his finger with her tiny hand. After dinner, while Mrs. Rivera and Adelaide cleared the dishes, Knox approached with an apologetic expression. "I should have asked if you'd be comfortable dining with us all," he said quietly. "If you'd prefer to take your meals at your cabin, that's perfectly fine." Adelaide shook her head. "No, it was lovely. Everyone has been so kind." Knox looked relieved. "Good, I want you both of you to feel at home here." He glanced at Elizabeth, who was now dozing in Adelaide's arms. "She seems content." "She is. The fresh air tired her out, I think." Adelaide smiled down at her daughter. "And thank you for the cradle. It's beautiful." A faint flush colored Knox's tan cheeks. It was nothing, just thought she might need her own bed. But they both knew it was far from nothing. Such a gesture spoke of care and consideration beyond what an employer might ordinarily show. As twilight settled over the ranch, Knox walked Adelaide and Elizabeth back to their cabin. The setting sun painted the hills in hues of gold and purple, just as he had promised. "You were right," Adelaide said, pausing to take in the view. "It's breathtaking." Knox stood beside her, his hat in his hands, watching the same sunset he'd seen countless times before, but somehow seeing it anew through her eyes. "Never gets old," he agreed softly. Then, with a gentle touch to Elizabeth's sleeping head, he bid them good night and walked back toward the main house. Adelaide stood watching him go, realizing with a start that for the first time since James had abandoned her, she felt something like hope unfurling in her chest, hope not just for survival, but for happiness. What she couldn't have known then was how tightly their fates would soon become intertwined, or how the simple act of one man's kindness would change all their lives forever. The next few weeks established a rhythm to Adelaide's new life at the Porter Ranch. Each morning, she rose at dawn to feed Elizabeth, before walking to the main house to prepare breakfast for Knox and the ranch hands. The men would set out for their day's work, while Adelaide tackled the household chores: laundering, cleaning, baking bread, and preparing the evening meal, all while keeping one eye on Elizabeth, who was becoming more mobile by the day. Mrs. Rivera proved to be a patient teacher, showing Adelaide how to manage the large house efficiently and teaching her to cook the hearty meals the men needed after long days of physical labor. Though the work was demanding, Adelaide found satisfaction in it, especially when Knox or the others complimented her cooking or thanked her for mending their clothes. In the evenings, after the dishes were washed and put away, Adelaide would often sit on her cabin porch with Elizabeth, enjoying the peaceful twilight. Sometimes Knox would stop by, ostensibly to check if they needed anything, but increasingly just to visit. He would sit on the porch steps, his long legs stretched out before him, and tell stories of the day's work or memories from his childhood on the ranch. Adelaide learned that his father had been a Confederate soldier who returned from the war shell-shocked and prone to dark moods. His mother had been the steady force holding the family together until her death 5 years earlier. Knox had taken over the ranch at 18 when his father's health began to fail, and he'd been running it ever since. Weren't you ever tempted to leave? Adelaide asked one evening in late May as they watched fireflies begin to blink in the gathering darkness. See more of the world beyond Willow Creek, Knox considered this, rolling a blade of grass between his fingers. Thought about it once or twice when I was younger. Even packed a bag once when I was 16, was going to head to California. He smiled ruefully. Got as far as the creek before I turned back. This land gets in your blood. Couldn't imagine being anywhere else now. Elizabeth, who had been contentedly playing with a wooden toy Silas had carved for her, crawled over to Knox and pulled herself up on his knee, babbling happily. "Well, hello there, Miss Elizabeth," he said, his voice softening as it always did when he addressed the baby. "You joining the conversation?" Elizabeth responded by reaching for his face, her small fingers touching his stubbled cheek with fascination. Adelaide watched the interaction, her heart warming at the tenderness in Knox's eyes. Over the weeks, he had gradually become more comfortable with Elizabeth, sometimes holding her while Adelaide finished a task or walking with her when she was fussy. For a man who had never had children of his own, he showed a natural ease with her daughter that continued to surprise and touch Adelaide. "She's getting more curious every day," Adelaide observed, smiling as Elizabeth now attempted to grab Knox's nose. "That's good. Curious minds make for smart people." He gently caught Elizabeth's hand before it could poke his eye. "My sister's coming by tomorrow with her children. Thought Elizabeth might enjoy having some little ones to watch. Her oldest, Abigail, is good with babies." "That's very thoughtful," Adelaide said. "I'm sure Elizabeth would love the company." Knox's sister Margaret arrived the next day with her 4 children in tow: Abigail, aged 10, twins Samuel and Sarah, aged 7, and toddler Joseph, not yet 2. Margaret was a feminine version of Knox, with the same dark hair and blue eyes, though her face was rounder and more openly expressive than her brother's reserved countenance. "So you're the miracle worker who's got my brother's house in order," Margaret said warmly after Knox introduced them. "And this must be Elizabeth." "What a darling!" To Adelaide's relief, Margaret showed no signs of judgment about her unmarried status with a child. Instead, she seemed genuinely pleased to meet them both, and her children immediately took to Elizabeth, especially Abigail, who proudly showed the baby how to clap her hands together. The women prepared lunch while the children played in the shade of a large oak tree, Knox and Margaret's husband Benjamin keeping watch nearby. "Knox speaks very highly of you," Margaret said as they kneaded dough for biscuits. "Says you've brought order to chaos around here." Adelaide blushed. "He exaggerates. Mrs. Rivera did most of the hard work setting up systems. I'm just following her lead." Margaret laughed. "Mrs. Rivera is a treasure, but from what I hear, you've added your own touches." She nodded toward a vase of wildflowers on the table and the freshly hung curtains at the windows. "This place hasn't felt this much like a home since our mother passed." Adelaide wasn't sure how to respond to that. "I just want to earn my keep. Knox has been very generous taking us in." Margaret gave her a sidelong glance. "My brother doesn't do anything out of mere charity, Adelaide. He saw something in you and that little girl that spoke to him." She smiled. "And I can see why. You've got grit, facing the world alone with a baby." "Not much choice," Adelaide replied, rolling out the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. "When Elizabeth's father left, I had to make my own way. Some men aren't worth the ground they walk on," Margaret said with surprising vehemence. "But some," she looked out the window to where Knox was now giving little Joseph a ride on his shoulders. "Some surprise you with how good they can be." After lunch, Margaret insisted on helping Adelaide with the dishes while the children continued playing outside. "You know," Margaret said casually, drying a plate. Knox has never shown much interest in settling down. Always said the ranch kept him too busy for courting. She handed the dried plate to Adelaide. But lately, he's been asking all sorts of questions about raising children. Even borrowed a book on the subject from the schoolteacher last time he was in town. Adelaide nearly dropped the plate. I'm sure that's just because of Elizabeth being here. He's been very kind to her. Margaret's eyes twinkled. Of course, I'm sure that's all it is. Her tone made it clear she believed nothing of the sort. Later that evening, after Margaret and her family had left, Adelaide found Knox on the porch of the main house, smoking a cigarette and looking at the stars. "Thank you for today," she said, joining him at the railing. It was wonderful for Elizabeth to spend time with other children. Knox extinguished his cigarette. "Margaret's been pestering me to invite her over. You gave me a good excuse." He smiled slightly. "She likes you. I like her too. She's very forthright." Knox chuckled. "That's one way of putting it. Meddlesome is the word I usually use." Adelaide laughed, then grew more serious. "She said something about you borrowing a book on raising children." In the dim light of the porch lantern, she thought she saw Knox's cheeks color slightly. "Just thought it might be useful, with Elizabeth here and all." Adelaide was touched by his consideration. "That's very thoughtful." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. "Mrs. Rivera leaves next week," Knox said finally. "You feeling comfortable with taking over?" Adelaide nodded. "Yes, I think so. She's taught me everything I need to know." "Good." Knox seemed to hesitate, then added, "Some of the ladies from town might talk when they hear you're staying on after she's gone. Don't let it trouble you." "I'm used to gossip," Adelaide replied, trying to sound more indifferent than she felt. In truth, she had hoped that the distance from town might insulate her from the judgmental whispers that had followed her since Elizabeth's birth. Knox turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "What happened with Elizabeth's father, if you don't mind my asking?" Adelaide hesitated. She rarely spoke of James, finding the memories too painful. But Knox had earned her trust these past weeks, and somehow it felt right to tell him. "His name was James Harrington," she began, her eyes fixed on the distant hills. "He was a law clerk in Philadelphia, handsome and charming. We met at a friend's dinner party, and he courted me, properly calling at my parents' home, bringing flowers, taking me for chaperoned walks in the park." She smiled sadly at the memory. "He asked my father's permission to marry me, and we were to be wed in the spring. But then—" She paused, gathering her strength. "Then I discovered I was with child. When I told him, he seemed happy at first, said we would simply move the wedding up. But the next day he was gone. Left a note saying he'd taken a position in Chicago and couldn't be burdened with a family just yet." Knox's expression darkened. "The coward. My parents were devastated by the scandal. They wanted me to go to a home for unwed mothers, give up the baby for adoption, and return as if nothing had happened. When I refused, they disowned me." She looked down at her hands. "A friend helped me find lodging and work until Elizabeth was born, but it became increasingly difficult to support us both. That's when I decided to come west to find my aunt." "And instead you found Willow Creek," Knox said softly. "And you," Adelaide added, meeting his eyes. "I don't know what would have become of us if you hadn't helped us that first day." Knox shook his head. "You'd have managed. You're stronger than you know, Adelaide." The way he said her name with respect, and something warmer made her heart beat faster. "Still," she said, "your kindness has meant everything to us. I want you to know that." Knox looked at her for a long moment, and Adelaide thought he might say something more. Instead, he straightened up and tipped his hat. "It's getting late. You should get some rest." As she walked back to her cabin in the moonlight, Adelaide found herself wondering what might have happened if she'd stayed on the porch a moment longer. There had been something in Knox's eyes, something beyond kindness or simple friendship, that had made her breath catch in her throat. But she quickly dismissed the thought. Knox Porter was her employer, and she was a fallen woman with a child born out of wedlock. Whatever she might feel stirring in her heart when he smiled at Elizabeth or stopped by her cabin in the evenings was a complication neither of them could afford. With Mrs. Rivera's departure, Adelaide took full responsibility for the household. The transition was smoother than she had anticipated. largely because Knox and the ranch hands went out of their way to express appreciation for her efforts and assist when they could. Silas would chop extra firewood without being asked. Miguel would bring fresh eggs from the henhouse on his way in from the bunkhouse each morning. Even old Pete, usually taciturn, would entertain Elizabeth with stories while Adelaide prepared dinner. As summer progressed, the ranch grew busier with the demands of the season. Knox often left before dawn and returned after dark, overseeing cattle drives to market, negotiating with buyers, and managing the endless tasks required to keep the operation running. Despite his exhaustion, he never failed to ask about Adelaide's day and spend a few minutes with Elizabeth before retiring. One sweltering July afternoon, Adelaide was hanging laundry while Elizabeth napped in a shaded basket nearby when she noticed a cloud of dust on the road leading to the ranch. Shielding her eyes, she made out a buggy approaching at a brisk pace. As it drew closer, Adelaide recognized Mrs. Wilkins and another woman from town whom she'd seen at church but hadn't formally met. Her heart sank. Unexpected visitors from town rarely brought good news for a woman in her position. She quickly finished hanging the last sheet and smoothed her hair and apron as the buggy pulled up to the main house. "Miss Grant," Mrs. Wilkins called, climbing down with the help of her companion. "Hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Adelaide replied, forcing a smile. "What brings you out this way?" "Social call," Mrs. Wilkins said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "This is Mrs. Beatrice Thompson, president of the Ladies' Aid Society." Mrs. Thompson was a tall, thin woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that took in every detail of Adelaide's appearance and the sleeping baby nearby. "Miss Grant," she said with a nod that stopped short of being friendly. "We've seen you at church, but haven't had the chance to become acquainted. Would you like to come inside for some tea?" Adelaide offered, though she dreaded whatever conversation was coming. "That would be lovely," Mrs. Thompson replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. In the kitchen, Adelaide busied herself preparing tea and slicing the fresh bread she'd baked that morning, all too aware of Mrs. Thompson's scrutiny. "You seem to have settled in quite comfortably," the woman observed, her tone making the words sound like an accusation. "Yes, Mr. Porter has been very kind," Adelaide replied carefully. Mrs. Thompson accepted the cup of tea Adelaide offered. "That's precisely what concerns some of us in town, a single man hosting an unmarried mother in his home. Well, it raises questions about propriety." There it was the real purpose of their visit. "I'm employed as Mr. Porter's housekeeper," Adelaide said evenly. "I have my own cabin on the property, and there are always others present during working hours." Mrs. Thompson sipped her tea. "Nevertheless, appearances matter, particularly for someone in Mr. Porter's position in the community. The arrangement seems irregular." Mrs. Wilkins, who had remained silent until now, cleared her throat. "What Beatrice means to say is that folks are talking and not all kindly." "I see." Adelaide's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "And what would you suggest? The Ladies' Aid Society has connections with a respectable home for women in your situation in San Antonio," Mrs. Thompson said. "They could help you find appropriate employment and perhaps a more suitable living arrangement for your child." Adelaide felt as though she'd been slapped. "You mean an orphanage?" "A loving Christian home," Mrs. Thompson corrected smoothly. "Many childless couples would welcome a beautiful baby like yours." Adelaide's throat tightened with fear and anger. "Elizabeth is my daughter. I would never give her up." "Sometimes the most loving choice a mother can make is to ensure her child has advantages she cannot provide herself," Mrs. Thompson insisted. "A child needs a proper family, a mother and a father." "She has a mother," came a deep voice from the doorway. All three women turned to see Knox standing there, his expression thunderous. He must have ridden in while they were talking, unheard over their conversation. "Mr. Porter," Mrs. Thompson said, regaining her composure quickly. "We were just discussing Miss Grant's situation." "I heard." Knox's voice was dangerously quiet as he stepped into the kitchen. "And I don't appreciate anyone coming onto my property to suggest separating a mother from her child." Mrs. Thompson drew herself up. "We're merely concerned about the welfare of the child and your reputation, Mr. Porter." People are beginning to talk. Let them talk, Knox said flatly. Miss Grant and her daughter are under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. The firmness in his tone left no room for argument. Mrs. Thompson's lips thinned to a tight line. I see we've overstayed our welcome, she said stiffly, setting down her teacup. Mrs. Wilkins, shall we go? Mrs. Wilkins looked apologetically at Adelaide as she stood. Didn't mean any harm, girl. Just thought you should know what's being said. After showing the women out, Adelaide returned to the kitchen to find Knox still there, his expression troubled. I'm sorry about that, she said quietly. I never meant to damage your standing in the community. Knox shook his head. You've done nothing wrong. It's their narrow minds that are the problem. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I should have anticipated this. Small towns run on gossip, and we've given them plenty to chew on. Elizabeth's cries from outside interrupted them. Adelaide hurried out to find her daughter awake and fussy in her basket. When she returned with Elizabeth in her arms, Knox was pacing the kitchen. Maybe I should leave, Adelaide suggested reluctantly. Find work somewhere else where we won't cause problems for you. Knox stopped pacing and looked at her directly. Is that what you want, to leave? No, she admitted. Elizabeth and I are happy here, happier than we've been anywhere since she was born. Knox's expression softened as he looked at them both. Then stay, please. He stepped closer, gently touching Elizabeth's cheek. This is your home now, both of you. The word home caught in Adelaide's chest. She hadn't had a real home since her parents had shown her the door. The idea that she and Elizabeth might truly belong somewhere with someone was almost too much to hope for. What about the gossip? She asked. Your standing in the community is important for the ranch. Knox's eyes met hers, steady and determined. Some things are more important than what people think. Before Adelaide could respond, they heard horses approaching outside. Knox glanced out the window. Cattle buyers from Fort Worth, he said. I need to meet with them, but this conversation isn't finished. His hand briefly touched her arm. We'll talk more tonight. After Knox left with the cattle buyers, Adelaide went about her afternoon chores with a distracted mind, turning over the morning's events. The threat implied in Mrs. Thompson's visit had shaken her deeply. The idea that someone might try to take Elizabeth from her was her greatest fear, yet Knox's reaction had given her hope. The way he had defended them, his insistence that this was their home now, it suggested something beyond mere employer-employee concern. As promised, Knox sought her out that evening after supper. Adelaide had just put Elizabeth to bed in the cabin and was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea when he approached. Mind some company? He asked, hat in hand. Please, she replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Knox settled into it with a tired sigh. The day's work had left smudges of dirt on his face and clothes, but he seemed too preoccupied to notice. I've been thinking about our situation, he began without preamble. There's a way to silence the gossips and protect you and Elizabeth. Adelaide's heart quickened. What way? Knox turned to face her directly, his blue eyes intent in the fading light. Marriage. Adelaide stared at him, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon. I'm proposing marriage, Adelaide, to you. Knox's voice was steady, but she noticed his hands gripping his hat a bit too tightly. As my wife, no one would question your place here. Elizabeth would have my name and protection. The talk would stop. Adelaide felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. You want to marry me to stop gossip, Knox frowned. That's not the only reason. Then what are the others? She pressed, needing to understand. He looked away, seemingly struggling to articulate his thoughts. You're good for this place, for the house, the ranch, the men respect you. And is that enough reason to marry? Adelaide asked quietly. Knox hesitated. There's Elizabeth too. She deserves a father, someone to look after her, teach her things. Knox. Adelaide's voice was gentle but firm. Those are all practical considerations. Marriage should be more than that. He met her eyes again, and this time she saw vulnerability beneath his usual composure. What if I said I've grown fond of you both? That the cabin feels empty when you're not in it, and the days seem longer when I can't see Elizabeth smile? Adelaide's breath caught. Is that true? It is. Knox set his hat aside and took her hands in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I'm not good with fancy words, Adelaide. I can't promise romance like you might read in books. but I can promise to be a good husband to you and a good father to Elizabeth. I can promise to respect you, provide for you both, and do my best to make you happy." Tears pricked at Adelaide's eyes. After James's betrayal, she had resigned herself to raising Elizabeth alone, never expecting to find a man who would willingly take on another man's child as his own. "You don't have to answer now," Knox added quickly. "Think on it. Talk to Margaret if you like. Just know the offer stands whenever you're ready." Adelaide studied his face in the gathering twilight, the strong lines softened by genuine concern, the blue eyes that had never looked at her or Elizabeth with judgment, only kindness. "I don't need time," she said softly. "Yes, Knox, I'll marry you." Relief and something warmer spread across his features. "You're sure?" Adelaide nodded. "I'm sure. You've shown me what kind of man you are every day since we arrived. I would be proud to be your wife and for Elizabeth to call you father." Knox's smile transformed his face, erasing the weariness and worry. Slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle, questioning kiss that held the promise of deeper feeling to come. When they parted, Adelaide felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. It wasn't the passionate love she had once felt for James, but something steadier and perhaps more enduring, a foundation of respect and caring on which stronger feelings could grow. "When?" Knox asked, still holding her hands. "Soon," Adelaide replied, "before Mrs. Thompson can rally more support for her suggestions about Elizabeth." Knox nodded. "I'll speak to Reverend Parker tomorrow. 2 weeks should give us time to prepare." As he walked back to the main house a while later, Adelaide watched him go with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. Her life had taken so many unexpected turns, from respected daughter to shamed outcast, from desperate mother to soon-to-be rancher's wife. Elizabeth would have a father, a name, a secure future. And Adelaide would have a second chance at happiness with a man whose quiet strength and integrity had slowly but surely won her trust and affection. It wasn't the love story she had imagined as a girl, but perhaps it would be something better, a love built on choice and character rather than fleeting passion. A love that included not just her but her daughter as well. As the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, Adelaide offered up a silent prayer of thanks for the day a dusty cowboy had stopped to help a shamed woman and her baby, changing all their lives forever. News of the engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some, like Margaret and Mrs. Wilkins, expressed wholehearted approval, while others, particularly Mrs. Thompson and her circle, received the news with tight smiles and meaningful glances. But as Knox had predicted, the official announcement of their upcoming marriage effectively silenced the worst of the gossip. An arrangement that had seemed scandalous when undefined became respectable when formalized by the promise of wedding vows. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Margaret helped Adelaide alter one of her mother's old dresses into a suitable wedding gown, and Knox rode to the county seat to secure a marriage license. The ranch hands, delighted by the news, constructed a wedding arch from twisted branches and planned to decorate it with wildflowers on the day of the ceremony. 3 days before the wedding, Adelaide was in the kitchen making preserves when a rider approached the house. Through the window, she watched Knox greet the man and accept a telegram. As he read it, his expression darkened. "Bad news?" Adelaide asked when he entered the kitchen, the paper still clutched in his hand. Knox hesitated. "Could be nothing. Cattle rustlers hit the Johnson place 20 miles north of here last night. Sheriff thinks they might be working their way south." Adelaide felt a flicker of fear. "Are we in danger?" "Probably not," Knox assured her. "But I'm sending Miguel and Silas to keep watch on the North Range tonight, just in case. Pete and I will stay closer to the house." That evening, Knox checked and cleaned his rifle at the kitchen table while Adelaide mended a shirt nearby, Elizabeth playing contentedly at their feet. The domesticity of the scene struck Adelaide how quickly they had fallen into the rhythms of family life, even before their vows. "This feels right, doesn't it?" Knox said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "The three of us here together." Adelaide smiled, looking up from her sewing. "It does." I've been thinking, Knox continued, reassembling his rifle with practiced hands. After we're married, I'd like to adopt Elizabeth legally, make her my daughter in name as well as heart, if you agree, of course. Adelaide's hands stilled. You would do that, of course. Knox looked surprised at her question. I want her to have my name, to know she's mine as much as yours. He set the rifle aside and reached down to ruffle Elizabeth's dark curls. Besides, look at her. She's already got me wrapped around her little finger. Elizabeth giggled, reaching up for him, and Knox lifted her into his lap with easy familiarity. Over the past weeks, the baby had become increasingly attached to him, often holding out her arms to be picked up when he entered a room. She loves you, Adelaide said softly. The feeling's mutual, Knox replied, bouncing Elizabeth gently on his knee. Never thought I'd take to fatherhood so quickly, but here we are. Adelaide watched them together, her heart full. Whatever initial pragmatism had motivated Knox's proposal, there was no denying the genuine affection he held for her daughter. And for her. There was tenderness there too, expressed not in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in 100 small ways the coffee poured for her each morning, the wildflowers left on her cabin doorstep, the way his eyes sought hers across a room. It wasn't the consuming love she had once felt for James, but perhaps that was for the best. That love had burned hot and quick, leaving only ashes. What was growing between her and Knox felt more like a slow burning flame, steady and warming. The next day dawned stormy, with distant thunder rumbling across the plains. Adelaide was hanging the last of the laundry on the covered porch when she noticed a rider approaching at a gallop through the rain. It was Silas, his horse lathered with exertion. Knox emerged from the barn, intercepting the ranch hand before he reached the house. They spoke briefly, their expressions grave, before Knox nodded and Silas wheeled his horse around and rode back the way he had come. What's happened? Adelaide called as Knox strode toward her. Rustlers hit the Parsons place last night, he said grimly. Took 20 head and shot one of their hands, sheriffs forming a posse to track them. I need to go. Fear clutched at Adelaide's heart. Now, in this weather, trail will wash away if we wait. Knox was already heading toward the house, presumably to get his gun. I'll ride with the posse, make sure they don't come this way. Adelaide followed him inside, Elizabeth on her hip. When will you be back? Tomorrow, if the tracking goes well. Knox retrieved his rifle and checked the ammunition. Pete will stay here with you and Elizabeth. Miguel and Silas are already with the sheriff. But the wedding is still 2 days away, Knox finished for her, pausing to look at her directly. I'll be back in time, Adelaide, I promise. She wanted to protest further but knew it would be futile. This was part of life in the West, the constant vigilance required to protect one's livelihood against those who would take it by force. Knox pulled on his slicker and hat, then crossed to Adelaide and Elizabeth. He kissed the baby's forehead first, then, after a moment's hesitation, Adelaide's cheek. Lock the doors tonight. Pete will be in the bunkhouse if you need anything. His eyes held hers, concern evident. I'll come back to you both as soon as I can. Then he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Through the window, Adelaide watched him mount his horse and ride away into the rain, a knot of worry forming in her stomach. The day passed slowly. Adelaide kept busy with wedding preparations, but her mind continually returned to Knox riding through the storm after armed men. Pete checked on her regularly, his weathered face betraying none of the concern she suspected he felt. By evening, the storm had intensified, with lightning flashing across the darkened sky and thunder shaking the windows. Adelaide put Elizabeth to bed in the cradle Knox had made, soothing her daughter's fear of the thunder with soft songs and gentle rocking. Once Elizabeth was asleep, Adelaide found herself unable to rest. She paced the small cabin, jumping at every crack of thunder, her imagination conjuring images of Knox injured or worse. Finally, unable to bear the solitude and worry any longer, she wrapped Elizabeth in a blanket, covered them both with a shawl, and hurried through the rain to the main house. The kitchen was dark and empty, but the familiar surroundings brought some comfort. Adelaide lit a lamp and settled into a chair by the stove with Elizabeth sleeping against her chest, determined to wait for news. She must have dozed off, for she woke with a start to the sound of horses in the yard. The storm had passed, leaving only a steady rain, and the kitchen clock showed it was just past midnight. Laying Elizabeth gently on a blanket by the stove, Adelaide moved to the window. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Knox's broad-shouldered silhouette dismounting in the yard, followed by Miguel and Silas. They were safe. She flung open the door just as Knox reached the porch steps, his face haggard with exhaustion, clothes soaked, and mud splattered. "You're back," she said, the simplicity of the words belying the depth of her relief. Knox looked surprised to find her there. "Adelaide, what are you doing in the main house at this hour?" "I couldn't sleep. I was worried." She stepped back to let him enter. "Are you all right?" "What happened with the rustlers?" Knox removed his dripping hat and slicker, running a hand through his damp hair. "Tracked them to the river. They crossed into Indian territory, sheriffs arranging with the territorial authorities to continue pursuit tomorrow." He noticed Elizabeth sleeping by the stove. "You brought the baby out in this weather." "I couldn't stay alone in the cabin," Adelaide admitted. "Not with you out there in danger." Something in Knox's expression softened. He crossed to her in 2 strides and, without warning, pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his damp shirt. "I'm sorry I worried you," he murmured against her hair. Adelaide relaxed into his embrace, inhaling the scent of rain, horse, and man that clung to him. It was the first time he had held her so intimately, and despite the circumstances, she found herself savoring the strength and warmth of him. "I kept thinking about Elizabeth," Knox said quietly, still holding her. "About you. About what would happen to you both if something happened to me." Adelaide pulled back slightly to look up at him. "Nothing happened. You're here." But it made me realize something. His blue eyes were intense in the lamplight. "I need to make sure you're both taken care of, no matter what. Tomorrow, I'm changing my will, putting the ranch in your name if anything happens to me." Adelaide stared at him in shock. "Knox, that's not necessary. The wedding is in 2 days exactly, 2 days during which anything could happen." His hands moved to frame her face. "I meant what I said, Adelaide. You and Elizabeth are my family now. I want to make it official in every way possible, as soon as possible." Before she could respond, he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss, unlike their first tentative one on the porch. This was a kiss born of fear and relief, of realization and determination. It spoke of a man who had faced mortality and returned with certainty about what mattered most. Adelaide responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck, her body arching into his. All the worry and fear of the day transformed into a desperate need to affirm life, to connect with the man who had become the center of her world almost without her noticing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Knox rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me tomorrow," he said hoarsely. "I don't want to wait another day." "But the preparations, Margaret, the guests, can all wait for a proper celebration later. Tomorrow, just us, the Reverend, and witnesses. Please, Adelaide." The urgency in his voice, the intensity in his eyes, made it impossible to refuse. And in truth, she felt it to the sudden, pressing need to make their bond official, to claim the security and future he offered before fate could intervene again. "Yes," she whispered. "Tomorrow." The next morning, Knox rode into town at first light to speak with Reverend Parker. By noon, he had returned with news that the Reverend had agreed to perform a small ceremony at the ranch that afternoon. Margaret and her husband would serve as witnesses, bringing only the children and a simple wedding cake Margaret had hastily baked. Despite the rushed arrangements, Adelaide felt a sense of rightness as she dressed in the blue gown she and Margaret had altered. It wasn't the elaborate white dress of her first engagement, but it suited the woman she had become: practical, resilient, and unconcerned with appearances. Margaret arrived an hour before the ceremony, shooing Knox away. It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding. And helping Adelaide with her hair and final preparations. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, pinning a sprig of wildflowers to Adelaide's hair. "And more importantly, you look happy." "I am," Adelaide replied with surprise, realizing it was true. Despite the circumstances that had brought them together, despite the practicality that had initiated their arrangement, genuine happiness had bloomed between the cracks of necessity. "And my brother?" Margaret asked, a knowing glint in her eye. "How do you feel about him?" Adelaide considered the question carefully. I respect him deeply, I trust him completely, she paused. And I'm coming to love him, I think. Not the way I thought love would be, but something stronger perhaps. Margaret squeezed her hand. The best marriages grow from respect and trust. The rest follows naturally. The ceremony took place under the cottonwood trees near the creek, where the ranch hands had erected the simple arch decorated with wildflowers. Elizabeth, dressed in a clean white gown, was held by Margaret's oldest daughter, who beamed with pride at her important role. Knox waited beneath the arch with Reverend Parker, dressed in his Sunday best, his usually tanned face slightly pale with nerves. When Adelaide appeared on Benjamin's arm, standing in for the father who had disowned her, Knox's expression transformed, a smile breaking across his features like sunrise over the plains. The Reverend kept the service brief but meaningful. When it came time for the vows, Knox surprised Adelaide by speaking from the heart rather than merely repeating the traditional words. "Adelaide, I take you as my wife, and I take Elizabeth as my daughter," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to protect you both, to provide for you, to respect you, and to be faithful to you all the days of my life. This ranch, this land, this life, I share it all with you freely and completely." When it was her turn, Adelaide found herself similarly moved to speak her own truth. "Knox, I take you as my husband, and I give you my trust, my loyalty, and my partnership. I promise to stand beside you in all things, to make a home with you, and to raise our daughter with love and strength. Whatever comes, we will face it together." The simple gold band Knox placed on her finger had belonged to his mother. As Reverend Parker pronounced them husband and wife, Knox kissed her with a tenderness that belied his rugged exterior, his hands gentle as they cradled her face. The small celebration afterward was joyful despite its simplicity. The ranch hands had prepared a feast, and Margaret's cake, though hastily assembled, was delicious. Little Elizabeth was passed from person to person, accepting kisses and cuddles from her newly official family with delighted giggles. As twilight fell, the guests departed, leaving the new family alone. Knox carried Elizabeth, now drowsy from all the excitement, as he and Adelaide walked hand in hand to the main house. "I moved your things from the cabin while you were getting ready," Knox explained as they climbed the porch steps. "Hope you don't mind," Adelaide smiled. "Not at all." At the threshold, Knox paused. "Tradition says I should carry you across," he said with a hint of mischief in his eyes. Adelaide laughed. "With Elizabeth in your arms already, I think we can forego that particular custom." But Knox had other ideas. With a swift movement, he shifted Elizabeth to one arm and swept Adelaide up with the other, making her gasp in surprise. "Porter men keep their promises," he said, carrying both his wife and daughter across the threshold with ease. Inside, the house already felt different to Adelaide, no longer her workplace but her home. Knox had arranged for flowers to be placed in vases throughout the main rooms, and a fire burned cheerfully in the grate despite the summer evening, creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Together, they put Elizabeth to bed in the nursery that had once been Knox's childhood room, recently outfitted with her cradle and a rocking chair. The baby went down easily, exhausted from the day's festivities. Alone at last, husband and wife faced each other with sudden shyness in the master bedroom. The space had been refreshed with new linens and curtains, Knox's few bachelor possessions neatly arranged to make room for Adelaide's things. "Is this really happening?" Adelaide asked softly. "Yesterday I was your housekeeper, and now you're my wife," Knox finished, stepping closer to take her hands in his. "But you were never just my housekeeper, Adelaide. From the moment you and Elizabeth arrived, you were something more. What was I?" Knox considered this, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "A second chance, for this house to be a home again, for me to be more than just a rancher." He drew her closer, one hand moving to cup her cheek. "I know our beginning wasn't conventional. I know I'm not the man you dreamed of when you were a girl, but I promise you this: I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Adelaide leaned into his touch. "You already are." The kiss that followed sealed their vows more completely than any ceremony could have. As Knox's arms encircled her, As the last barriers between them fell away, Adelaide felt the final pieces of her heart, the pieces that had been shattered by James's betrayal, and her family's rejection, begin to heal and reshape themselves around this new love, this new life. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Knox's heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Adelaide thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From shame to acceptance, from isolation to family, from fear to security. The road had been harder and more winding than she could have imagined, but it had led her home to a place where both she and her daughter were cherished, not despite their past, but as they were, completely and without reservation. "What are you thinking?" Knox murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Adelaide smiled in the darkness. "That sometimes the things we think are our greatest mistakes turn out to be our greatest blessings. If I hadn't trusted James, I wouldn't have Elizabeth. If I hadn't been cast out, I wouldn't have come west. If I hadn't stepped off that stagecoach in Willow Creek, I wouldn't have found you," Knox finished. He tightened his arms around her. "And I would never have known what I was missing." Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the main street of Willow Creek, Texas, much as it had the day Adelaide first arrived. But the town had grown in the intervening years, boasting a new schoolhouse, a bank, and several more businesses along the dusty thoroughfare. Adelaide Porter stepped out of the general store, packages tucked under one arm, her free hand holding tightly to that of a dark-haired little girl of nearly 6. "Can we get candy, Mama, please?" Elizabeth Porter, legally adopted by Knox within months of the wedding, looked up with pleading green eyes so like her mother's. "Not today, sweetheart. We need to fetch your brother from Mrs. Wilkins and get home before your father worries." Adelaide adjusted her hat against the glare of the sun, her other hand unconsciously resting on the slight swell of her abdomen, where their third child was just beginning to make its presence known. Elizabeth skipped alongside her mother as they made their way to the cafe, where Mrs. Wilkins, now semi-retired but still ruler of her kitchen domain, was minding 2-year-old James Porter while Adelaide ran her errands. "Miss Adelaide," called a familiar voice. Adelaide turned to see Reverend Parker approaching, his Bible tucked under his arm. "Just the person I wanted to see. The Ladies' Aid Society is organizing a fundraiser for the new church bell. We were hoping you might contribute some of your preserves for the auction." Adelaide smiled warmly. "Of course, Reverend, I'd be happy to." "Wonderful, Mrs. Thompson will be pleased." The Reverend beamed before continuing on his way. The irony wasn't lost on Adelaide. 5 years ago, Beatrice Thompson had tried to separate her from her child. Now, the formidable president of the Ladies' Aid Society regularly sought Adelaide's contributions to town events, and even on occasion, her advice on community matters. The change in attitude had come gradually as Knox and Adelaide established themselves as one of the area's most respected families. Knox's ranch had prospered, expanding to include adjacent properties as smaller operations folded. Adelaide had become known for her organizational skills, often helping coordinate community efforts during times of hardship or celebration. But the most significant factor in their acceptance had been Knox himself, the unwavering way he had stood by Adelaide and Elizabeth from the beginning, his clear pride in calling them his family, and his absolute refusal to entertain any suggestion that his wife and daughter were anything but blessings in his life. Inside the cafe, Mrs. Wilkins was bouncing young James on her knee, the gruff woman utterly transformed by the presence of the toddler who had been named for her late husband. "There's your mama, young man," she said as Adelaide and Elizabeth entered. "Been good as gold, he has. Had a bit of pie and told me all about the new foal." James squirmed down from her lap and ran to Adelaide on sturdy legs. "Mama, I helped Mrs. Wilkins make pie." Adelaide scooped him up, breathing in the scent of cinnamon and little boy. "Did you? What a big helper you are." After thanking Mrs. Wilkins and promising to send over some fresh eggs, Adelaide herded her children out to the wagon Knox had left for her use. As she helped them climb aboard, she caught sight of her reflection in the store window across the street, a confident woman in a simple but well-made dress, her auburn hair neatly arranged beneath a straw hat, a wedding band gleaming on her finger. The frightened, shamed young mother who had arrived on the stagecoach 5 years ago was barely recognizable in this assured rancher's wife. Yet Adelaide knew that woman was still part of her. Her experiences had shaped, but not defined her. The ride back to the ranch was filled with Elizabeth's chatter about her upcoming birthday and James's increasingly creative descriptions of the new foal. As they crested the rise that offered the first view of home, Adelaide felt the familiar surge of gratitude at the sight of the prosperous ranch spread out before them. The house had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, with a new wing added after James's birth. The barn was larger now, the herd more numerous, the cottonwoods along the creek taller and more generous with their shade. Knox was waiting for them in the yard, deep in conversation with Miguel, who had been promoted to foreman 2 years earlier. At the sound of the wagon, he looked up, his face breaking into the smile that still made Adelaide's heart skip a beat after all this time. "Papa," Elizabeth called, waving excitedly. Knox excused himself from Miguel and strode toward them, reaching the wagon just as Adelaide set the brake. Without hesitation, he lifted first James and then Elizabeth down, accepting their enthusiastic hugs before turning to help his wife. His hands lingered at her waist as he set her on the ground. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching hers with the concern he'd shown throughout both her previous pregnancies. "Perfectly well," she assured him, touching his cheek affectionately. "We bought everything on the list and the children were very good." Knox kissed her briefly, then turned his attention to the packages. "Let me get those. You two rascals can help me unload while your mama rests a bit." As Knox headed toward the house with a child clinging to each hand and packages balanced in his arms, Adelaide lingered a moment in the yard, taking in the scene before her. This life this family had begun with an act of simple kindness from a stranger who saw beyond shame and circumstance to the people beneath. "Adelaide," Knox called from the porch, having dispatched the children inside. "Everything all right?" She smiled and moved toward him, toward home. "Everything is perfect." And as she joined her husband on the porch of the house, they had built together not just with wood and nails but with trust and patience and growing love. Adelaide knew it was true. The road that had seemed so dark when she stepped off that stagecoach had led to a light brighter than she could have imagined. Knox wrapped an arm around her waist as they watched their children through the window, Elizabeth showing James how to arrange the wooden animals Knox had carved for them in a careful line across the floor. "Happy?" he asked simply. Adelaide leaned into his solid warmth, thinking of all they had overcome, all they had built, and all that still lay ahead, a future rich with possibility and secure in love. "Beyond words," she replied, and together they stepped inside to join their family.